Welcome to your Financial Legacy podcast. I am your host, Maria Ellis. On every episode, I will bring you my perspective and the perspective of my guest on financial planning and estate planning topics. Here at the Financial Legacy podcast, we are changing lives one person at a time. To help you create a financial plan that will lead you to success, connect with us at financiallegacy.live for your complimentary consultation. Today we're having a special guest, a real estate attorney, Lynn Figman. Lynn specializes in doing both residential as well as commercial real estate. And we are extremely lucky today because not only is she going to be addressing you as a potential seller, but also you as a potential buyer, and also we'll be talking about the current market conditions, both of residential as well as commercial. So we're going to be doing 3 consecutive episodes. I hope you could join us in all of them. So for now, please help me welcome Lynn Figman. So, Lynn, tell us about what's going on in the market right now. This is a wonderful buyer's market, right? So, in our prior episode, we were looking at, the challenges that the sellers have in this buyer's market. If we're addressing our buyer at this point in time, it's just buyer's heaven.
Bye.
Yeah, bye. Negotiate.
Yes. I leave it to the experts such as yourself to do that. But again, as I said in the last episode, I'm sitting here behind a desk and I see the deals after they're already done because I get the term sheet and I start going. But I, of course, read all of the real estate trade papers that I can. But I rely really on the yourself because you have access to reports and research and algorithms, etc. Because in New York, being a broker is a profession.
Yes, it is indeed, because it's so dynamic, especially now with the COVID market. And for those of you who we have actually, participants that are joining us from all over the world. We have clients in Brazil, Turkey, Argentina, Dubai, Singapore, Beijing. So this is a global pandemic, and in these days what we're doing, as I'm working with the buyers, is just doing a lot of teleconference. As a matter of fact, some of the properties we are doing, we're working together with the sellers, and the sellers are showing via Zoom meetings their apartments because the sellers themselves don't want to have people come in and walk around the house. So it's a totally different market right now. As if you are a new buyer, it's important for you to have a team of people that you work with. One of them will be your agent. Then you will have an attorney like Lynn, who is highly qualified to represent both buyers and sellers in the New York City area. She does both residential and commercial, as you know. So how I usually work is I work with a team of people. But before we do that, I like to always get together with a particular buyer to see what is the time frame of the buyer, what are the finances capability of the buyer, what areas they're interested in, and sometimes managing their expectations is very important. As a matter of fact, a lot of the times managing their expectations because they don't know about the dynamics of the marketplace. That's a first-time buyer. Then other kinds of buyers are people who are moving into the city or were moving into the city.
They will be moving into the city.
They will be moving into the city. Absolutely. It's a very important point to make. And then you have investors. And right now we are looking at a lot of investors because these are wonderful times for buyers, and they are looking to buy, especially in condominiums, where they could get it at a lower price and be able to rent it as the market improves overall. So once we have been able to identify a particular property that the buyer qualifies financially, And you have different kinds of buyers, we have either a cash buyer or we have somebody who is looking for financing. So one of the primary things that we do is actually connect them with our lenders, give them 2 or 3 lenders if they don't have one already, and get them pre-qualified, because it's very important to know how much money you actually have to be able to invest. And so if we're looking at a condominium, and let's say you're looking at 1 bedroom for $800,000, as an example, in a building that has amenities, and you may only have to put 10-20% down in that case. So, if you have $200,000 to invest, the likelihood of you getting approved is pretty good if you have good credit. On the other hand, if you don't have good credit, and if you have to put greater than 20%, actually, even though the building may not require a higher down, the banks may require higher down if your debt to equity ratio is higher than the bank, allows. So there's again many factors involved in there. So it's knowing what the buyer wants, knowing the time frame, and knowing how capable he or she is in terms of, the dollar amount that they want to invest. Is it going to be their primary home? Is this a first-time buyer, or is this an investor that has different kinds of objectives in mind? So once we have identified that and we have actually looked at properties, actually, even before we look at properties, I always like to say, hey, do you have an attorney who is going to be representing you? And that attorney has to be a New York City-based attorney that knows the New York City law, because otherwise it gets very difficult because they are not familiar with how we negotiate contracts here in New York City. So I usually immediately make a call and make that introduction so that they know, the attorney knows and the client knows that they are going to have proper representation. So assume for a minute that we have found the ideal place for our particular buyer, and that they are in the process, that they have been already pre-qualified, and that they are in the process of what is called the due diligence. Tell me all about that.
The all important. Yes. Well, no, again,
actually, you get to review the contract before that.
Exactly. And Maria, over the years, you haven't learned that from me. You must bring the lawyer in the beginning before the property's found.
Yes.
And just a little nod to that, you bring up New York. Yes, New York is a world unto its own. New York City, it is a mistake not to have a qualified broker. And I don't necessarily call people like you, Maria, brokers. I call you financial advisors, because really investing in New York is what that is. And there are plenty of people who will take, perhaps less commission or this or that. But the role of a good broker is to do the research beforehand, not to just show. Anyone can just take a key and show an apartment.
Right.
So really, you are an advisor. And then from an attorney's perspective, in representing a buyer, it's a lot more difficult than representing a seller most of the time. And that is because in New York, the contract is sent out by the seller's attorney. And as a buyer's attorney, I then have to pore through the contract for what is missing.
Right.
Rather than what is there. Now, some lawyers will send you what is called a standard form. And there are several standard forms. And after you've done, they won't doctor it up too much. But that is the minority. The majority of sellers' attorneys will attach a very thick document called a rider to the printed form of contract. And again, the experience of the attorney is very important, because you aren't looking necessarily to strike out too much, but there's a heck of a lot that you can add to the contract that you're proffered. And that's where no matter how many buyers I've represented over the years, I take an extra cup of coffee approaching the contract to make sure I'm really focused in on what I might be missing. And of course, I have my checklists, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, we negotiate the contract and we go back and forth. And sometimes I get all the points I asked for. Sometimes I get none. Most of the time it's kind of in between. And it depends on how reasonable the attorney is and how reasonable the seller is. And at some point, I think, Maria, it's important again to touch on the concept of the team you're working with, because in New York, so many deals are dependent on the reasonableness of the parties.
Yeah, and the parties have to know that they're working for a client, client, right? So it has to be a team effort, and the time frame in which things are to take place are very important. It's right now in New York City, due to COVID, we are in the buyer's market. So there are a lot of investors, obviously, that are putting 2 or 3 offers in different apartments, and the speediness in which the contract is negotiated is critical. And in our prior conversation, when we were talking about how we represent the seller, we were talking about the term sheet. And the term sheet, again, is very important because it's the basis for the contract that the attorney representing the seller is going to be sending you as you're representing the buyer. And that's where the game, sort of the fun begins.
Yeah, I would argue the fun begins with you and trying to find the exact right property and then negotiate the exact right price, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, it's teamwork indeed, from zero to from the cradle to the grave, so to speak. It's definitely teamwork. This is why I like to get the attorney involved right at the very beginning, as well as the lender. If it is not a cash deal, I like to get the lender right away once we're able to identify a particular building, an apartment that the client might be interested in. Because depending on the bank, some banks have different guidelines for lending money to certain buildings that perhaps one owner might have 40% of the apartments in that building, as an example. So the lenders do not like to lend in buildings that, there is one person that owns, more than 30, 40% of apartments because of obvious reasons. If something happens financially to that particular owner in that building, then there's going to be concerns about being able to pay the maintenance in that building. So that's an area of consideration, in addition to whether the buyer has a good credit, whether the buyer has a salary, or if it is a commission-based job. So the lender has many areas to consider. But so I like to bring that team that you were referring to, because it's critically important.
May I jump in on the lending point for a second?
Yes, absolutely.
Have you found the pre-qualification letter, which is again something I think particularly unique to New York City, is helpful when you have a client who is putting in a bid on a property?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you for bringing that up. I usually, that's because we start from the very beginning with the team approach. We usually have a pre-qualification letter when we make an offer, because you as the seller would like to be able to know whether that person is financially capable of closing on the deal. And having a pre-qualification letter from a lender is not necessarily guaranteed, because it's not an actual commitment, but it is a pre-qualification that says, hey, this person is capable of financing and making payments because they have enough income to be able to, comply with the commitments and be able to make those maintenance payments that you have and the mortgage payment and so on and so forth. So tell me a little bit about, you were saying once you receive the contract from the seller's attorney, you have a famous checklist. What do you have in that checklist?
Oh, I can't give away all my secrets. I'm going to have to do what Bob Dylan recently did. I'm going to have to sell the rights to my work. Well, first of all, I have to make sure that the contract that I get agrees with the term sheet,
Right.
because many sellers' attorneys, in an effort to move the deal quickly, they'll send out a contract and sometimes they don't proof it. They just want to get the flow going.
Right.
And the price can be wrong. The parties can be wrong. Frankly, even the address of the premises can be wrong. So I look at, yes, just those basics. The next thing is, if there is financing, the most important clause is the financing contingency provision,
Right.
which is, I think we're going to have an entire segment just on the financing contingency provision, Maria.
Exactly. Yes.
And that's where, again, the broker slash advisor, attorney, and bank, potential bank, have to work together. So I would say, aside from checking the facts, again, the parties, the address, the closing date, any time of the essence provisions, which under New York law is, again, very unique and has serious repercussions, if not dealt with, is another thing that I look for. It can be hidden in any provision of a contract that I get. Sometimes the buyer needs me to add that time of the essence provision. The financing contingency, as I said, the all-important, and we talked a lot about this, my sconce story,
Yes.
in the last segment, the personal property that is included. And again, oftentimes in representing the buyer, I will get a standard list that is on a printed form of what is included. And then I must go over that, that list. And 95% of the time, there are things in representing the buyer that the buyer thought was included or would like to purchase.
Right.
And I have to check with the broker, and then you, or someone you work with, will have to perhaps go back into the apartment and make up a checklist of exactly,
Right.
and then I will rely on you to tell me, and then I will rely on my client to tell me the sconce is included, the sconce is not included.
Right.
And so there are attorneys who don't look at that provision as being all that important. And it might not seem important when you sign the contract. But believe me, when you get to the closing table after the walkthrough the morning of the closing, that more often than not ends up being the most important clause.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's where negotiations will have to take place, and hopefully we're dealing with reasonable parties that we could come to an agreement, right? If I'm thinking about right now in terms of some of my clients who are moving to the suburbs. For instance, I have a client moving into Poughkeepsie, which is about an hour and a half from New York City. The seller is interested in a cash deal. The buyer is interested in buying the property, but they want to actually get financing. So here is a unique situation where we could have a contingency waive that you were talking about earlier. So tell us a little bit more about the contingency and what are the advantages and disadvantages of that.
Okay, again, it really is a business deal depending on what the needs are of the party. I just want to come back to the fact that you mentioned Poughkeepsie, which is not in New York City.
Right.
Is the property, let's come back to a very basic question. What type of property? House?
It's a single home.
Okay.
Single home.
Okay, so that's an entirely different copyrighted or to be
Exactly.
copyrighted checklist.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I think in a hot market like this, we have a situation where the buyer
hot markets for the buyers.
For the buyers, buy.
Yes.
But they still need to get a mortgage.
Oh yeah.
And the seller in a hot market will say, you know what? There's a line of buyers behind you who will pay me all cash, and I can close next week.
And above price, by the way.
And above price.
Ask.
So Now, this is complicated further, by the way, in talking about the financing decision, I would add, because we're at record low mortgage interest rates
Exactly.
in this area.
Yeah, yeah.
So then the decision is, even if you have the cash to buy the property as a buyer, is that the best place to put your cash? Or why not get a mortgage at such a low rate?
Yeah, right now you're able to get 30-year fixed mortgage rates for, between 3% and 3.5%, depending on your credit ratings and whatnot, and on the deal. So you bring a very important point, and that is, even if you have all the cash, do you actually want to pay all cash? So it really goes back to that buyer in terms of what their intentions are for the use of that money. Maybe they buy 2 or 3 properties by financing them all, right? Instead of just putting your cash in one single property. So, of course, there are risks associated with it as well. Are they going to buy and hold onto those property, or they could only live in one property at a time, right? Or unless you're like me, flying from New York to Atlanta to Miami.
That's right. Well, very few of us can afford that high-flying lifestyle that you have, Maria.
Thank you for making that happen for me. It's teamwork.
Okay, one can aspire.
So yeah, but
it's again negotiation.
Yeah, in terms of how the contract reads, Lynn, if it is where we actually waive the contingency, will the contract still say is being financed, but we're waiving the contingency as one of the clauses in the contract?
Yes. And depending on, and you're talking about New York City forms where they have the financing contingency provision is sort of an A, B, C, D choice, and what applies, you cross out. But when you get into Poughkeepsie, when you get out of the New York City market, and when you get out of using these form contracts, there's no contingency at all if that's the deal. But I think the important thing for a buyer to understand is they are given within that contingency, if the seller says you can have a mortgage, what that means, which it means that the seller is holding that property off of the market while you, the buyer, are pursuing getting a loan and agreeing to get that loan within a certain period of time for a certain amount and at a certain percentage. And that is the financing contingency provision in a contract. If you don't get that as it's laid out in that provision, if you don't get that 30-year mortgage at 50% of the purchase price within 30 days of the contract, and again, these are all negotiable terms that I just mentioned, then you may lose the ability to buy the house, and the seller can put it back on the market. So that is the most common reason that deals, you might say, quote, fall apart, but in fact, they're provided for in the contingency provision. They don't really fall apart. The buyer has not been able to secure the financing that it needs within the certain period of time. And so they tell the seller, listen, according to the financing, contingency, I get my deposit back.
Right.
And then the seller can put it back onto the market. Now the problem, and again, it's all governed by the current of our contemporary market. Many sellers, if they feel they have a hot property or actually need the cash quickly, will not agree to give the buyer that financing contingency.
So it's very important to specify that in the contract because your deposit could be at risk.
Correct.
Yeah. So let's go back to New York City and let's look at condos and let's look at, what do you do after you get the contract? They have a full executed contract. What's next in the process?
In representing the buyer?
This is a buyer's conversation.
Okay. Well, I say to my client at the outset of the representation that I'm very important okay, for
Yes.
for a very particular, for various segments during your journey
Yeah.
to closing.
Yeah.
Once the contract is signed, my importance wanes, and the importance of the broker slash advisor and the lender, if there's a lender involved, they, the spotlight shines on them, and the lawyer sort of fades while financing is arranged.
Hmm.
Okay, which is, for a buyer dealing with a bank, as you know, it's a good part-time job to get financing.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so as the lawyer, I will ask the broker, I'll ask my client, keep me informed. How is your loan application going? Just so I get a sense of timing. Okay, but there's very little really for the lawyer to do during that period. Now,
Right. So I'm sorry. I think that we skipped the part that I wanted you to concentrate a little bit, which is the due diligence, which
okay,
it takes place before you actually have, we have the buyer signing the contract,
right.
because that's very
So
critical.
it's very critical. And again, the teamwork in working with the
Yes.
broker is very important to get access to the materials that I need to look for in due diligence.
Mhm.
And the due diligence will vary depending on the type of property. So let's talk about a condominium. In a
Yes.
condominium in New York, it is similar to what most people understand is buying a house. You order a title report. And that is, again, what the attorney does. Once the contract is signed, you order a title report. And in ordering that title report, there is a menu of searches that you can order. Violations against the property from the fire department, violations from the Department of Buildings, other municipal violations, environmental violations. And then again, the attorney sits back and waits for the title company, which in a condominium is very important, and you
Yes.
pay for their services, which I always tell clients from the get-go, in working up their budget, you must buy title insurance when you buy a
Yes.
condominium, and that can get a little hefty. But it's a must. So
Yes.
the due diligence really on a condominium is sent to me by the title company. That is what I call the Bible of that
Mm.
particular property. It will tell me about the taxes. It will tell me about litigations in the building.
Yes.
It will tell me everything. And then I go through it. And the most important thing that clients ask about is my read on the financials of the building.
Right.
And again, I call you, Maria, and I say, let's discuss the financials. Are we getting the most updated financials?
Exactly.
Okay. Um, and I will discuss with the client, look, there's a lien against the property, or there is a lawsuit going on in the building that may cost you down the road, because although you are buying a unit, you're buying a unit with common areas.
Right.
And so you have got to maintain the lobby and the elevator and the boiler. And that could raise your monthly, what most of the world calls HOA
Hmm. Yes.
fees, but which are here called maintenance or common charges every month.
Right.
So I will look at whatever legal filings there are against the property and the building that the title company tells me about, and I will, do a crunch of the finances and make sure that I have the latest finances. I will send those because most buyers are sophisticated. These financial statements don't require, for the most part, the input of an accountant. It will
Right.
tell you how much the building has in reserve in case of an emergency. They're easy to read, but so that is my due diligence in a condominium, and it is a lot easier to do when I get that complete title report from a good title company that is hopefully digging deep into the records and turning over that report quickly, because things may surface that need us to rectify before we get to closing. And to rectify some problems that pop up in title sometimes is time consuming.
Yeah, because often, well, I haven't seen one lately, but sometimes there's not a common link of ownership, and something has happened, and we don't know who owned when where, right? And that's part of the due diligence.
Yes. Yes, that is a big problem because more and more, and again, we need another segment on this with a tax attorney.
Right,
How is the client going to buy the property? Are they going
right.
to buy as an individual? Are they going to buy as a married couple? Are they going to buy as an unmarried couple? Are they going to buy as a limited liability company or as a corporation or a subchapter C? The type of entity that is the buyer is an is a crucial element, crucial interest to the buyer for tax purposes.
No, absolutely. And we are going to have another session specifically on taxation that is going
Good.
to be addressing those kinds of questions. Going back to the title, I think obviously that's a critical piece of the overall due diligence that you do. And could you explain a little bit to clients who may not be quite as familiar with how do you obtain title in a condominium versus a co-op?
Okay. I'll throw in a house as well, the house in Poughkeepsie, for
Yeah, we call
example.
the brownstones here in New York City.
Right. Okay. In a condominium, it is similar to a house in that you get a deed when you buy.
Right.
Okay. The document that you walk out of closing with, or if you have financed, the bank walks out of the closing with, is the deed. In a co-op, you are a shareholder in a corporation. As such, that corporation has minutes that their board members must write. And in those minutes, oftentimes they're monthly meetings, the tales of what's really going on in the building are revealed. That they are concerned about budgeting because a boiler has broken and the bids are coming in at such and such. The elevator, the lobby will need renovation, and so they're going to have to increase the monthly costs or file a special assessment on the owners to take care of that property. So my due diligence involves going, although more and more it's computerized, but managing agents keep those records. Again, that is another party that is involved
Right.
when you are buying, particularly in a co-op, particularly important, and particularly important that they be reasonable and accessible. So I will read the minutes, and I will read, as with a condo, I'll read the financials, and I will order a watered down version of the title report. That you don't call it a title report in a co-op. It will basically be a search for violations and for lawsuits and any other liens that are filed against the property or the seller. And the diligence, truthfully, in a co-op purchase, it's kind of the lawyer and the real estate advisor, broker, you, Maria,
Yes.
become very important because mostly what's going on in the building are water cooler, what I call water cooler or elevator conversation.
Right.
Because more and more boards do not want to put in writing what's happening, what the problems are in the building. And so the broker has to sort of talk to the other broker and know the lay of the land, because it's not legal as much as sort of the gossip of the building.
Right, exactly, because it hasn't yet been material enough perhaps to even include it in the minutes or whatever. And like you were saying earlier, some financial statements are not audited statements, they're just simply reviewed or compiled. So it may not have all the necessary footnotes that are required in an audited statement. The due diligence in a co-op especially is so much more of importance because in a co-op situation, it could be that the corporation that holds title to that company has debt that they have acquired in the prior years for renovations, or like you were giving an example, a boiler needs replacement or whatever. So that is a major concern in terms of, do we anticipate monthly maintenance to go up? When is the actual loan going to become in, maturity of the loan? Will they be able to have an extension? And then it gets even more complicated if it is a land lease situation where the co-op sits. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, I try not to talk to clients too much about that unless they're excessively interested, in which case I send them a treatise that I have online, and they say, they tell me it's the best, soporific that they've used in their lives, and they just keep dozing off as they read it.
Yeah.
So in New York, there is the ground that the building is located on. And then, of course, there's the building. And then within the building, there are the units, individual units. And then there are the common areas. Most times in the hot areas of Manhattan, the land underneath the building is not owned rather by the corporation that owns the building or the individual owners within the building. It is owned pursuant to what is called the 99-year land lease. Does that mean that the landlord is going to come in after 99 years and you buy and you're in year 98 and say the lease with the building is terminated and therefore you must move and get rid? No. What it is an ancient New York City tax-driven fiction. So the truth is that I try and take care of any, they're also called not land leases, but ground leases. I try and take care if there's any issue regarding that 99-year lease, really without discussing too much of it with the client. Because as a practical matter, it doesn't affect your purchase.
It doesn't affect your purchase unless you have a situation that I currently have in Midtown, where they are in the process of negotiating to buy the land. So what does that mean then? That means that all the prices have come down even worse than the COVID. Now we're having the issue of, that maintenance that you have $3,000 a month is going to go up to $6,000 or $9,000, depending on, what terms and conditions that purchase of the land. So it's important, again, that's part of the due diligence and part of the full disclosure that the agent and the attorneys have to provide to the client.
Now, this goes back to something we discussed in the last segment about the attorneys being the last to know. I will not know, because it is not a matter of public record, that there are negotiations going on.
Right.
Okay. Until the negotiation is done and the closing happens. Yes. So I have to say to the client, there can be negotiations regarding the current land lease. All I can see from the record, because it has to be recorded,
right,
is that the public file is showing me that there's a mortgage on the land, that the mortgage expires at such and such a time, or the entire 99-year land lease expires at such and such a time. And so that the broker advisor has to sniff around and see what's going on. Is that going to be, tooled with? Are there negotiations going on? I can ask the attorney for the seller to sniff it out, but oftentimes they don't know either, and they don't want to spend their time trying to find that out. So as an attorney, neither the seller nor the buyer can make a representative can make an affirmative comment regarding the negotiations that might or might not be going on.
Right.
So we really need to, I need to say, Maria, tell me what's going on, because all I'm seeing is that there's a recorded 99-year lease.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to determine based on the price variations. when you look at a building that is currently co-op being negotiating the land, a one-bedroom apartment is selling for $200,000, and in a prime location. So there's no free lunch. I always tell my clients, there's no free lunch. You have to, find out why the price is so low, or if the maintenance is higher than the comparable units. Why is that the case? So there's always a story behind. The numbers will tell you a story, and it's a process of that due diligence and investigate for the research that you were talking about. So it's very important for you as the buyer to be able to have the right team of people that are going to help you select the right property and be able to close successfully. So tell us about a successful closing. What happens at a closing? Who brings what kind of documents?
What's a successful? The key to a successful closing, honestly, is the team that you talk about having worked together from day one to communicate with each other, to share the information that they get, to dig out information that might be necessary, and to hammer preparation, so that when you walk, and in New York, one of the few jurisdictions left in the United States where you actually do a closing in person, although COVID, and we can get into that maybe in another section, because COVID has appended the in-person closing process. Closings are obviously still happening, but there are all sorts of regulations for doing closings now online, including notarizations.
Right.
And filings, of course. So preparation is the key. And so it starts with the contract and the due diligence and the getting the financing, if that's applicable, and getting the approval of the co-op board. Let's not forget that is a very important aspect in buying a co-op.
Yes.
Providing information to the co-op board so they can evaluate the purchaser, frankly, and then getting to closing and working out the figures. With a condo, you don't have the co-op board hurdle. And so when a buyer enters into a contract, for the most part, they are just subjected to a bank if they're getting financing, and the due diligence, they're not subjected to the yes or no arbitrary decision of a co-op board. I think that's probably the biggest hurdle, frankly, once we get past the financing to getting to the closing table. I am very particular about preparation, to the point where when people walk in and they meet me, because we've been primarily emailing and talking on the phone, they say, well, you're a lot nicer than you were in the lead up. And I say, that's because as you don't give me what I need to prepare, I get more and more frustrated.
Right.
Because there's no reason for our respective clients to be sitting at a closing table, and the brokers, and if it's a co-op, the managing agent. There's no reason, because we can set forth the figures, we can circulate the closing figures, do the tax filing drafts, etc., before we walk into the closing, so that right. At the closing in a half hour, if everyone's on time, unusual in New York, but if everyone's on time, checks or wire confirmations happen, and documents, lots of documents, because that's true no matter what kind of property in New York, get signed, and you can walk out half hour, 45 minutes. Without preparation, you show up, you'll have lawyers that will show up at the closing table. They will not have figured out apportionments. They will not have done their tax calculations. Or you'll have a bank that may show up unprepared, and then the closing can take all day.
Yeah, it becomes very time consuming and very frustrating for all parties involved, because at that point in time there is a lot of pressure. So yes, being prepared and having all the documents ready, I think, is key to a successful closing. Any final words that you'd like to advise to our buyers?
Work with you. Work with Maria. Work with Maria, because she has a team. And in New York, it is not wise to buy real estate of any kind, at any price, in any neighborhood, without having the proper team. And it all flows from that.
Well, with that, I thank you. Thank you so much
My
for being part of
pleasure.
my life and helping our clients do successful closings. Thank you again.
My pleasure. Good day.
You, for tuning into with me and our special guest, real estate attorney in New York City, Lynn Figman. To learn more about me and Lynn, go to the financiallegacy.life for a complimentary consultation. Here at the financiallegacy.life, we help you create your financial plan and help you create your financial legacy. So contact us at financiallegacy.life for your complimentary consultation. And thanks again for being with us today. Thanks, Lynn.
My pleasure.